Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where humanity clings to survival against threats that would shatter the minds of lesser beings, there exists a force so exceptional, so utterly beyond the comprehension of ordinary warriors, that their very existence seems almost mythical. These are not the Space Marines, those legendary angels of death who defend the Imperium across 1,000,000 worlds. No, these warriors stand above even those transhuman giants. They are the Adeptus Custodes, the Golden Legion, the Emperor's own chosen guardians, and they represent the absolute pinnacle of what humanity can achieve when resources, knowledge, and purpose align with singular perfection. Imagine for a moment standing in the presence of a custodian. The first thing that strikes you is not merely their size. Though they tower over ordinary humans and stand taller even than most Space Marines, it is the sense of absolute, terrifying perfection that radiates from every aspect of their being. Their armor gleams like captured sunlight, worked in gold and precious metals that would ransom entire star systems. Each plate, each curve, each embellishment is a masterwork of artifice, handcrafted by the finest artisans Terra has ever produced. But it is not the armor that truly inspires awe. It is what lies beneath. When a custodian moves, there is a grace that defies their massive stature, a fluidity that speaks of muscles and reflexes engineered beyond anything nature could produce. When they speak, their words carry weight and authority that comes from minds as sharp as the blades they wield. When they fight, they become something altogether different. A golden storm of martial perfection that leaves destruction in its wake. These are warriors who were designed to stand in the presence of the Emperor of mankind himself, to be worthy companions to a being of godlike power. They were created to be perfect, and in many ways, they achieved that impossible goal. But what does it truly mean to be a custodian? How strong are these golden giants? To understand their might, we must journey back through 10,000 years of history, back to the very birth of the Imperium, back to when humanity first began to unite under the banner of the man who would become the Emperor. We must explore the secrets of their creation, the nature of their enhancement, the battles they have fought, and the impossible standards they maintain, and only then can we truly grasp the magnitude of what the Adeptus Custodes represent. This is not merely a story about powerful warriors. It is a story about what happens when the greatest scientific mind humanity has ever produced decides to create the perfect guardians. It is about dedication taken to its ultimate extreme, about duty that transcends the boundaries of mortality, about warriors who were made to be companions to a god and who have carried that burden for millennia. The custodians are strong, yes, but their strength goes far beyond mere physical prowess. They are strong in purpose, strong in loyalty, strong in the absolute certainty of their cause. As we delve into the depths of what makes a custodian, prepare yourself for revelations that will reshape your understanding of power in the 40k universe. These are not soldiers. They are not even Space Marines, those paragons of transhuman might. The custodians are something else entirely, something that exists in a category all their own. They are the Emperor's gift to himself, the guardians who were worthy of standing watch over the master of mankind. And their story is one of the most fascinating in all of Warhammer 40,000. The dawn of perfection, long before the Imperium stretched across the stars, long before the Space Marine legions were even a concept in the Emperor's grand design, there was terror. Ancient Earth, ravaged by millennia of warfare, divided into countless techno-barbarian kingdoms and warlord domains, a world that had fallen far from the heights of human civilization. In this age of darkness and strife, a being of immense power walked among humanity, preparing to unite the scattered remnants of mankind under a single banner. This being, who would come to be known as the Emperor of Mankind, understood that his grand vision would require warriors of exceptional capability. The Emperor had already experimented with genetic enhancement. He had created the Thunder Warriors, those brutal and powerful soldiers who had served as his shock troops during the early unification wars. These warriors were formidable, possessed of strength and ferocity that allowed them to shatter the armies of the techno-barbarians and bring entire nations to heel. But the Thunder Warriors, for all their might, were flawed. They were unstable, their enhanced bodies degenerating over time, their minds prone to fits of violence and madness. They were weapons of conquest, but they were not what the Emperor truly needed for his ultimate purpose. What the Emperor required was something more refined, more perfect, more worthy. He needed warriors who could stand in his presence without being overwhelmed, who could serve not just as soldiers, but as companions and counselors. He needed guardians who would be absolutely incorruptible, whose loyalty would never waver, whose capabilities would allow them to face any threat that might dare approach the person of the Emperor himself. And so, drawing upon knowledge of genetic science that far exceeded anything possessed by even the most learned of the Mechanicum, the Emperor began work on his greatest creation, the Adeptus Custodes. The process of creating a custodian bore no resemblance to the relatively crude methods used to create Space Marines. Where a Space Marine received gene seed implants derived from the Primarchs, organs that would be surgically placed within their bodies to trigger transformation, a custodian underwent something far more fundamental. The creation of a custodian began in infancy, with children selected from among the nobility of Terra. These were not merely any children, but those who met exacting standards of genetic purity and potential that only the Emperor's own examinations could determine. The transformation of these infants into custodians involved bioalchemy of such sophistication that even in the 41st millennium, with the Emperor unable to provide direct guidance, the process remains shrouded in the deepest mystery. It was not a matter of adding organs or implanting gene seed. Instead, the very genetic code of the subject was rewritten at a cellular level. Every molecule, every strand of DNA, every aspect of their physical being was carefully reshaped according to the Emperor's design. This process took root not just in their flesh, but in their very souls, binding them to the Emperor in ways that transcended mere loyalty or programming. The transformation was neither quick nor simple. While Space Marines could be created in a matter of years, starting with adolescence and rapidly enhancing them to full combat readiness, the creation of a custodian took far longer and began far earlier. The process started before the subjects could even form memories, with genetic modification beginning in late infancy and continuing throughout their development. Each custodian was essentially handcrafted, was a unique work of genetic artistry tailored to the individual. Unlike Space Marines, who shared gene seed and were essentially mass-produced from common templates, no two custodians were created in exactly the same way. This individual approach meant that each custodian represented an enormous investment of time, resources, and the Emperor's personal attention. In the early days, the Emperor himself oversaw the creation of every single custodian, examining each candidate, designing their specific enhancements, monitoring their development with the care of a master craftsman, creating a priceless artifact. Even in the modern era, with the Emperor's direct involvement no longer possible, the creation of new custodians remains the province of Terra's most skilled bioalchemists and chirurgeons, working from techniques and knowledge that are among the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets. The enhancement process did not merely make custodians physically superior, it transformed every aspect of their being. Their muscles were denser and more efficient than even a Space Marine's enhanced tissue. Their bones became harder than ceramite, their skin tougher than flak armor, their internal organs redundant and resilient beyond anything natural evolution could produce. Their senses were sharpened to supernatural keenness, able to track enemies by the faintest sound, detect threats by smell alone, see in conditions that would leave even a Space Marine effectively blind. Their reflexes operated at speeds that made them appear to move before their enemies could even begin to react. But the physical enhancements, remarkable as they were, represented only part of what made a custodian exceptional. The Emperor understood that his guardians would need to be more than just superior warriors. They would need to be capable of operating in any environment, dealing with any situation, understanding threats, both martial and political. And so the mental enhancements were just as comprehensive as the physical ones. A custodian's mind operated with a clarity and speed that would shame the greatest human savants. They could process tactical information in an instant, formulating and discarding dozens of strategies in the time it took an ordinary human to blink. Their memories were essentially perfect, able to recall every moment of their existence with absolute clarity. The training that accompanied these enhancements was equally comprehensive. Where Space Marines were trained primarily as soldiers, masters of war and combat, Custodians received an education that would be the envy of the greatest scholars in the Imperium. They studied philosophy and history, learning the great works of human civilization across the ages. They mastered diplomacy and rhetoric, able to navigate the complex politics of the imperial court with the same skill they brought to the battlefield. They learned arts and culture, becoming versed in music, poetry, and all the finer aspects of human achievement. This was not mere decoration or unnecessary refinement. It was essential to their purpose. These were warriors who would stand in the Emperor's presence, who would be fit companions for the greatest mind humanity had ever produced. Whilst the Custodians who emerged from this process were extraordinary by any measure. They stood taller than Space Marines, their gene-enhanced frames reaching heights of 8 feet or more. They possessed strength that allowed them to tear apart armored vehicles with their bare hands, speed that let them dodge bullets and move like golden blurs across the battlefield, durability that could shrug off wounds that would kill even a Space Marine instantly. But more than this, they possessed an aura of absolute authority, a presence that radiated from their very being. To stand near a Custodian was to feel the weight of the Emperor's own power, to sense that you were in the presence of something more than merely human. In the earliest days of the Unification Wars, the Custodians fought alongside the Emperor, their golden armor shining like beacons of hope amid the darkness of Terra's savage conflicts. They were few in number compared to the Thunder Warriors, but where they fought, victory was assured. A single Custodian could hold a gate against hundreds of enemies. A squad of Custodians could break an army. When the Emperor moved against the techno-barbarian fortress at Nassau, it was the Custodians who led the assault, their guardian spears flashing in the dim light as they carved through the defenders like a golden storm. As the Unification Wars progressed and Terra slowly came under the Emperor's dominion, the Custodians remained at his side. They were his constant companions, his most trusted advisors, the only warriors he valued enough to keep close to his person at all times. While the Thunder Warriors raged across Terra, breaking armies and bringing nations to heel, the Custodians stood guard over the Emperor himself, ensuring that no assassin's blade, no treacherous attack, no surprise assault could ever threaten the Master of Mankind. By the time Terra was finally united and the Emperor turned his gaze to the stars, preparing for the great crusade that would bring humanity's scattered worlds back into the fold, the Custodians had reached their full strength. 10,000 warriors, each one a masterpiece of genetic engineering, each one capable of standing against threats that would overwhelm entire companies of lesser soldiers. They were known as the 10,000, and their reputation had already spread throughout the newly unified Terra. To see a Custodian was to witness perfection made manifest. To face one in combat was to face death itself, clothed in gold and wielding weapons of terrible power. These 10,000 guardians would serve as the Emperor's personal bodyguard throughout the Great Crusade. While the newly created Space Marine legions went forth to conquer the galaxy, bringing world after world into compliance, the Custodians remained on Terra or traveled in small numbers alongside the Emperor when he ventured forth. They were not conquerors. They were not meant for mass warfare or planetary invasions. They were guardians, protectors, warriors whose sole purpose was to ensure the Emperor's safety and to serve as his emissaries when matters required the personal touch of his authority. The creation of the Custodians represented the Emperor's first and perhaps greatest achievement in genetic engineering. They predated the Primarchs. It's those demigod generals who would lead the Space Marine legions. They predated the Space Marines themselves, those legions of transhuman warriors who would carry the Emperor's banner to the far corners of the galaxy. The Custodians were first, and in many ways, they remained the finest. They were proof that the Emperor could create perfection, that his mastery of genetic science was without equal, and they would prove, time and again, throughout the millennia to come, that they were worthy of that legacy. Beyond human, beyond Astartes. To truly understand the might of the Adeptus Custodes, one must grasp just how far beyond normal human capabilities they stand. The average citizen of the Imperium is already accustomed to witnessing transhuman warriors in the form of Space Marines. These angels of death tower over normal humans, are clad in power armor that amplifies their already prodigious strength, wielding weapons that can level buildings and shatter tanks. A Space Marine is faster, stronger, and more resilient than any baseline human could ever hope to be. Their enhanced senses can track enemies through walls. Their redundant organs keep them fighting through wounds that would kill ordinary soldiers instantly. Their training and experience make them tactical geniuses, capable of turning the tide of entire battles. And yet, a Custodian makes even a Space Marine seem crude by comparison. The physical superiority of a Custodian is immediately apparent to anyone who has witnessed both forces in action. Where a Space Marine might stand 7 to 8 feet tall in their armor, a Custodian towers even higher, yet their natural height augmented by armor that adds to their already imposing stature. But it is not merely size that sets them apart. A Space Marine moves with the controlled power of a predator, efficient and deadly. A Custodian moves like living lightning, their every motion a perfect expression of controlled violence. The speed differential is remarkable. In combat, Custodians have been observed moving so quickly that they appear as golden blurs, their guardian spears striking with such velocity that the eye cannot track individual attacks. The strength of a Custodian is similarly prodigious. While Space Marines can tear through lesser enemies with contemptuous ease, crushing skulls with casual backhand blows and ripping apart light vehicles with their bare hands, Custodians operate on an entirely different scale. Historical accounts speak of Custodians lifting and throwing armored Space Marines as though they were children, snapping power armor with their grip, crushing ceramite with casual squeezes of their enhanced hands. When a Custodian strikes with their full strength, armor crumples, bones shatter, and even heavily armored enemies find themselves hurled backward by the sheer force of the impact. This physical prowess stems from the fundamental differences in how Custodians and Space Marines are created. A Space Marine begins as a baseline human adolescent who receives 19 gene seed organs, implants that trigger transformations in their body. These organs cause the recipient to grow larger, develop a second heart, gain additional lungs, process toxins more efficiently, and develop numerous other enhancements. The result is impressive. But it is essentially an additive process. You take a human and add components to make them superhuman. A Custodian's creation works entirely differently. The bioalchemy that creates a Custodian doesn't add organs or implant gene seed. Instead, it rewrites the subject's genetic code at the most fundamental level. Every cell in a Custodian's body is altered, optimized, enhanced according to designs that represent the Emperor's absolute mastery of genetic science. Where a Space Marine has 2 hearts, a Custodian has organs that are so efficient they might as well be 3 or 4. Where a Space Marine's bones are coated with ceramite implants to strengthen them, a Custodian's bones are fundamentally denser and stronger from the genetic level up. The difference is like comparing a sword that has been sharpened to one that was forged from superior steel in the first place. The result of these different approaches is that Custodians exist in a category entirely separate from Space Marines. In direct combat between the two, the outcome is rarely in doubt. A Custodian can typically defeat multiple Space Marines in single combat. even when facing elite warriors like veteran sergeants or captains. The historical records contain numerous accounts of such encounters. During the Horus Heresy, when traitor Space Marines fought against loyalist forces, including Custodians, the difference was stark and terrible. Single Custodians held breaches against entire squads of Chaos Space Marines, their guardian spears weaving patterns of death that left transhuman warriors dead by the dozens. One of the most instructive examples comes from the Battle of Prospero, when the Thousand Sons Legion clashed with Imperial forces, including elements of the Legio Custodes. During this conflict, the Custodians demonstrated their superiority over even elite Astartes warriors repeatedly. When the Thousand Sons' most powerful sorcerers unleashed psychic devastation that would have reduced entire Space Marine formations to ash, the Custodians pushed through, their inherent resistance to warp energies protecting them where others would have fallen. Individual Custodians engaged entire squads of Thousand Sons warriors and emerged victorious, their perfectly honed combat skills allowing them to dismantle the sorcerer warriors of Magnus the Red with terrifying efficiency. The exact ratio of how many Space Marines a single Custodian could defeat has been debated extensively. But the consensus among those who have witnessed both forces in action suggests that a Custodian is worth somewhere between 5 and 10 Space Marines in combat effectiveness. This doesn't mean that a Custodian will always win against such odds. Space Marines are exceptionally dangerous warriors in their own right, and numbers can eventually overwhelm even the most skilled fighter. But in terms of pure combat capability, in terms of the threat a single warrior represents, a Custodian operates on a level that dwarfs even the mighty Astartes. This superiority extends beyond mere physical combat. A Custodian's mental capabilities far exceed those of a Space Marine as well. While Space Marines receive hypno-indoctrination and psychological conditioning that makes them fierce warriors and loyal servants of the Emperor, Custodians possess minds that were designed to operate at the highest levels of intellectual achievement. They are not merely warriors, but scholars, diplomats, and strategists of the First Order. A Custodian can debate philosophy with the greatest minds in the Imperium, compose poetry that would bring tears to the eyes of the most refined aristocrats, and navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics with skill that would shame professional courtiers. This intellectual capacity serves them well in their role as guardians. A Custodian doesn't simply react to threats, they anticipate them. And they analyze situations with a speed and depth that allows them to see patterns and connections that would escape lesser minds. This is why Custodians are so effective at their primary role of protecting the Emperor. They don't just fight threats as they appear. They identify and eliminate dangers before they can ever fully manifest. This proactive approach to security requires minds capable of processing vast amounts of information and drawing accurate conclusions from the subtlest of clues. The training that Custodians receive further amplifies their already exceptional capabilities. Where Space Marines are trained primarily for war, learning the arts of combat, tactics, and strategy, Custodians receive a far more comprehensive education. From their earliest years, they are exposed to the finest works of human civilization. They study the great military leaders of history, yes, but they also study the great philosophers, the master artists, the legendary diplomats and statesmen. They learn to appreciate beauty and culture, not as frivolous distractions, but as essential components of what they are protecting. This broad education makes Custodians uniquely suited for roles beyond simple combat. When the Emperor needed an emissary who could represent him to the most powerful figures in the Imperium, he often sent a Custodian. These warriors could stand in the halls of power and speak with the authority of the Emperor himself, their words carrying weight, not just because of the physical threat they represented, but because of the intelligence and wisdom behind those words. While a Custodian negotiating a treaty or delivering a message from the Emperor was not merely a messenger, they were a representative who understood the full context and implications of their mission. The longevity of Custodians adds another dimension to their superiority. While Space Marines are functionally immortal outside of violence, able to serve for centuries if they avoid death in battle. Custodians share this trait, but with an even greater degree of stability. The bioalchemy that created them did not simply extend their lifespan, it essentially halted their aging at the physical prime. A custodian who survives for 1,000 years does not deteriorate or weaken with age. They remain at their peak, their capabilities undiminished by the passage of time. This means that veteran custodians, those who have served for millennia, bring not just physical perfection, but also centuries or even millennia of accumulated experience to every engagement. Consider the implications of this. A space marine who has served for 300 years is considered ancient, a veteran whose experience is invaluable to their chapter. A custodian might serve for 3,000 years and still be in their absolute physical prime, their enhanced mind holding clear memories of events that have passed into legend for most of the Imperium. These ancient warriors have witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations, have fought against enemies that no longer exist, have accumulated tactical and strategic knowledge that spans millennia. When such a warrior enters battle, they bring not just superhuman physical capabilities, but also an understanding of warfare that few beings in the galaxy can match. The equipment that custodians wield further multiplies their already extraordinary capabilities. While Space Marines are issued standardized war gear produced to exacting specifications, custodian equipment is individually crafted to match each warrior's specifications and preferences. The armor a custodian wears is not simply protective gear, it is a masterwork of artifice, created by the finest artisans Terra can produce, using materials so rare and precious that a single suit could ransom entire worlds. The weapons they carry are similarly extraordinary, each one a unique creation that has often been passed down through generations of custodians, accumulating history and legend with each bearer. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of a custodian's superiority is something less tangible, something that goes beyond mere physical or mental capabilities. There is an aura about them, a presence that seems to radiate from their very being. This is sometimes called the aegis of the Emperor, and it manifests as a kind of psychic ward that surrounds them. Bullets and blades that should strike home mysteriously veer aside at the last moment. Psychic powers that would reduce other warriors to ash seem to flicker and fade when directed at a custodian. Enemy warriors find their courage failing in the presence of these golden giants, their resolve crumbling in the face of such manifest superiority. This phenomenon has been witnessed countless times throughout the custodian's history. During the Siege of Terra, when the forces of chaos assaulted the Imperial Palace with the full fury of the warp behind them, the custodians stood firm where even Space Marines faltered. Demons that could slaughter entire squads of Astartes found themselves unable to penetrate the golden line of custodian defenders. The corruption and madness that radiated from the chaos forces, capable of driving strong minds to insanity, seemed to slide off the custodians like water off polished gold. They were, in a very real sense, protected by the Emperor's own power, his gift to the warriors who had been created specifically to stand in his presence. When one considers all these factors together, the superiority of custodians over Space Marines becomes clear. They are faster, stronger, more durable, more intelligent, more skilled, better equipped, longer lived, and protected by forces that go beyond the merely physical. They represent the absolute peak of what human genetic engineering can achieve, the result of the Emperor's personal attention and effort poured into creating the perfect guardians. Space Marines are remarkable, certainly transhuman warriors who stand far above baseline humanity. But custodians are something else entirely, something that exists in a category all their own. The Golden Armory. The might of the Adeptus Custodes is not solely a product of their enhanced bodies and superior training. Part of what makes these warriors so formidable is the extraordinary quality of their equipment. While the Imperium produces war gear for its countless military forces with an emphasis on standardization and mass production, yet the armaments of the custodians follow an entirely different philosophy. Each piece of equipment a custodian wears or wields is a unique masterwork, created specifically for that individual warrior by the finest artificers Terra can provide. To understand the full extent of custodian strength, one must understand the tools they employ in their eternal vigil. The most iconic piece of custodian equipment is undoubtedly their armor. Known as custodian armor, or sometimes as auramite armor, after the precious metal from which it is primarily forged, these suits represent the pinnacle of the armorer's art. Unlike the ceramite-based power armor worn by space marines, custodian armor is constructed from auramite, an incredibly rare alloy that possesses properties far superior to any standard material. Its auramite is not merely stronger or more resilient than ceramite. It operates at what some tech priests whisper is close to a quantum level. Its molecular structure so refined that it borders on the theoretical ideal of protective materials. The process of creating a suit of custodian armor begins long before the metal is shaped or the power systems are installed. First, measurements are taken of the warrior who will wear it, not merely of their physical dimensions, but of their fighting style, their preferences, their very essence as a combatant. The artificers who craft custodian armor spend years on each suit, laboring over every detail with a dedication that would seem obsessive if the results were not so spectacular. Each plate is shaped to fit its wearer perfectly. Each joint is balanced to allow the most natural range of motion. Each curve and angle is designed not just for protection, but for aesthetic perfection. Because of this individualized approach, no two suits of custodian armor are exactly alike. While all custodian armor shares certain characteristics, the gleaming golden hue, the elaborate decorative elements, the sheer presence that radiates from these works of art, each suit bears unique flourishes that identify its wearer. Some custodians prefer more angular designs, with sharp edges and aggressive silhouettes. Others favor flowing curves and elegant lines that make their armor seem almost organic. Still others incorporate specific symbols or decorative elements that hold personal meaning, honors earned in battle, names of defeated enemies, or heraldry that dates back to their origins among Terra's nobility. While the protective capabilities of this armor are nothing short of extraordinary, the auramite construction provides defense against threats that would penetrate standard power armor with ease. Weapons that would cut through ceramite like paper often fail to penetrate auramite plating. The armor is proof against extreme temperatures, capable of withstanding the heat of plasma weapons or the absolute cold of the void. Its built-in power systems augment the already prodigious strength of its wearer, allowing a custodian to lift and move objects that would be immovable to lesser warriors. Advanced sensor arrays provide the wearer with awareness that extends far beyond what even their enhanced senses can detect naturally. But custodian armor is more than just protective gear and strength enhancement. But woven into its construction are systems of such sophistication that they border on the mystical. Refraction field generators create a subtle distortion around the wearer, causing incoming attacks to bend away at the last moment. This is not merely technological. Many believe that the armor itself is blessed with a fragment of the Emperor's own power, a ward that protects those who were created to stand in his presence. Whatever the truth, the effect is undeniable. Warriors wearing custodian armor seem to exist within a bubble of protection that goes beyond the merely physical, a field of improbability that causes even the most well-aimed attacks to somehow miss or lose their force at the critical moment.
You know, I have to pause here for a second because this is one of the things that genuinely blows my mind about the lore. The Emperor didn't just make the Custodians stronger than Space Marines. He made each one individually, like a master craftsman is creating a single perfect sword. While Space Marines are getting assembly line organs implanted, each Custodian is having their DNA rewritten cell by cell. It's the difference between buying a suit off the rack versus having one hand tailored specifically for you. And when you think about the fact he did this 10,000 times, creating 10,000 unique masterpieces, I mean, no wonder these guys are on a completely different level. It's actually insane when you really sit with that concept. But anyway, let's continue.
The weapons wielded by custodians are equally remarkable. The most iconic of these is the Guardian's Spear, and a weapon that has become synonymous with the Custodian Guard itself. At first glance, a Guardian Spear appears to be a relatively simple weapon, a long haft topped with a power blade and incorporating a bolt weapon into its construction. But this simple description fails to capture the true nature of these extraordinary armaments. A Guardian Spear is a perfectly balanced instrument of death, crafted with such precision that it responds to its wielder's intentions almost as an extension of their own body. The power blade component of a Guardian Spear is not the crude power weapon used by lesser forces. It is forged from materials that make standard power weapons seem primitive by comparison, its edge maintained at a molecular level through technology that few outside the Custodian Guard understand. When activated, the blade doesn't merely generate a power field, it creates a cutting edge so perfect that it can slice through nearly any material. Armor that would turn aside chainswords and power weapons alike parts like cloth before a Guardian Spear's blade. Enemy warriors find themselves bisected before they even register the attack, the spear moving so quickly and cutting so perfectly that there is no pain, only the sudden realization that they have been divided into pieces. The integrated bolt weapon, typically called a bolt caster, represents firepower far superior to the standard bolt guns carried by Space Marines. While a Space Marine's bolt gun fires mass-reactive rounds that explode inside the target, a bolt caster fires ammunition that has been refined and perfected over millennia. The rounds are more accurate, more powerful, and more reliable than standard bolt shells. They fly truer to their target, penetrate deeper into armor, and create more devastating wounds. A custodian, armed with a Guardian Spear, can engage enemies at range with punishing effectiveness, each shot finding its mark with uncanny accuracy before closing to melee range where the spear's blade can be brought into play. But Guardian Spears are merely the most common weapon in the Custodian arsenal. There exist numerous variants, each specialized for particular roles or threats. Adrasite spears incorporate Adrathic destructors, weapons that date back to the Dark Age of technology and that are capable of reducing targets to their component atoms. These terrible weapons are issued only when the Custodians expect to face the most dangerous foes, our enemies whose resilience is such that conventional weapons would prove insufficient. A target struck by an Adrathic beam simply ceases to exist, torn apart at the molecular level by energies that should not exist in real space. Pyrothite spears mount compact melter weapons, heat beams capable of reducing armor and fortifications to molten slag. These weapons are particularly effective against heavily armored targets or enemy vehicles. A pyrothite spear can melt through tank armor as easily as a hot blade through wax, the focused melter beam creating wounds that no amount of armor can fully protect against. When Custodians expect to face enemy armor or fortified positions, pyrothite spears are often the weapon of choice. For Custodians who prefer different weapons, there are sentinel blades, shorter weapons paired with ornate shields known as presidium shields. These warriors serve as the anchor of Custodian defensive formations, their shields large enough to provide cover, not just for themselves, but for their brothers. A presidium shield is not merely protective gear. It is a weapon in its own right, capable of smashing aside enemies who dare approach too close. The combination of shield and blade makes these warriors nearly impossible to dislodge from defensive positions, living walls of auramite and determination that can hold against charges that would overwhelm lesser forces. The vehicles and specialized equipment available to the Custodians are similarly extraordinary. Unlike most Imperial forces, which rely on ground vehicles like tanks and transport trucks, the Custodians have access to anti-gravitic technology that allows their vehicles to float above the battlefield. Grav vehicles like the Caladius and Pallas Grav attack craft provide fire support and mobility. Their advanced weapon systems laying down devastating barrages while remaining frustratingly difficult for enemy forces to target or destroy. These vehicles are not merely functional. Like all custodian equipment, they are works of art. Their hulls embellished with decorations and heraldry that make them as much symbols of imperial might as they are weapons of war. For rapid deployment and close quarters work, some custodians utilize jump packs, or the legendary Virtus Praetors ride Dawn Eagle pattern jet bikes. These vehicles are marvels of archaeotech, and combining speed and firepower in ways that make them among the most effective fast attack units in the Imperial arsenal. A squadron of Virtus Praetors can tear across a battlefield at speeds that make them nearly impossible to track. Their hurricane bolters laying down withering fire that tears through enemy formations before the Golden Riders close to engage with their interceptor lances. The sight of these golden warriors racing across the battlefield, their bikes leaving trails of disturbed air in their wake, is enough to break the morale of most enemy forces before a single shot is fired. Perhaps most impressive are the Alarus Custodians, elite warriors who wear Alarus Terminator armor, suits so powerful and protective that they turn their wearers into nearly invulnerable juggernauts. This armor is even more heavily built than standard custodian armor, incorporating additional layers of auramite plating and power field generators. An Alarus Custodian can walk through fire that would reduce other warriors to ash, can shrug off direct hits from anti-tank weapons, can wade through enemy formations like a golden titan. These warriors often serve as bodyguards to custodian commanders or as the spearhead of assaults into the most dangerous enemy positions. When an Alarus Custodian teleports directly into the heart of an enemy formation, their arrival heralded by the distinctive flash of teleportation energies, it is often the last thing that enemy ever witnesses. The quality of custodian equipment extends even to what might seem like minor details. The bolt shells they fire are handcrafted by master artisans, as the power cells that fuel their weapons are individually blessed and consecrated. The ceramics and metals that make up their equipment are sourced from the finest deposits in the Imperium, sometimes requiring expeditions to dangerous worlds simply to acquire materials of sufficient quality. Nothing is left to chance. Nothing is simply good enough. Every component, every system, every element is the best that humanity can produce. This obsessive attention to quality means that custodian equipment rarely fails. Where a space marine might experience a bolt gun jam or an armor system malfunction during a critical moment, such failures are virtually unheard of among the custodians. Their equipment has been crafted with such skill, maintained with such care, that it functions with absolute reliability. In 10,000 years of service, the custodians have lost remarkably few battles due to equipment failure. When a custodian falls in combat, it is because they have been overwhelmed by sheer numbers or faced a foe of extraordinary power, never because their weapons or armor betrayed them. The psychological impact of custodian equipment cannot be understated either. When enemy forces witness warriors clad in gleaming gold advancing toward them, weapons that shine like captured sunlight in their hands, the effect on morale is devastating. The custodians don't merely look impressive, they radiate an aura of absolute, terrifying perfection. Their armor is so finely wrought, so beautifully decorated, that it seems impossible that such works of art could be worn into battle. And yet there they are, these golden giants, moving with grace and purpose, their weapons raised to deliver death with precision and efficiency. This combination of aesthetic perfection and lethal functionality is entirely intentional. The Emperor designed the custodians not just to be effective guardians, but to be symbols of imperial might. They are walking monuments to humanity's potential, living proof that the species can achieve greatness when properly directed. Their equipment serves both practical and symbolic purposes, providing the tools necessary to face any threat, while also demonstrating the glory and power of the Emperor and the Imperium he created. When heroes fall and empires burn, the true measure of any warrior is not how they fight when victory is certain, but how they stand when all hope seems lost. For the Adeptus Custodes, This measure came during the darkest hours of the Imperium's history, when brother turned against brother and the galaxy burned in the fires of civil war. The Horus heresy was a cataclysm that nearly destroyed everything the Emperor had built, and at its climax came the Siege of Terror, when the forces of chaos laid siege to the Imperial Palace itself. It was here, in the defense of their home and their master, that the Custodians would prove beyond any doubt the magnitude of their strength and dedication. The Horus heresy began with treachery so profound that it still echoes through the millennia. Horus Lupercal, the War Master himself, the Emperor's most trusted son and the commander of his armies, fell to the corrupting influence of chaos. With him fell half the Space Marine legions, hundreds of thousands of transhuman warriors who turned their weapons against their former brothers. As the galaxy erupted into war, as loyalist and traitor forces clashed across 1,000,000 worlds. Throughout this terrible conflict, the Custodians maintained their vigil, ever watchful for threats to the Emperor. But the heresy brought challenges that even the Custodians had never anticipated. When Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, attempted to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery through sorcerous means, he inadvertently shattered the psychic wards protecting the Emperor's secret project in the Webway beneath the Imperial Palace. The Webway, a network of passages through the warp that would have allowed humanity to travel without exposing themselves to the dangers of the Imperium, became a breach through which the forces of chaos could assault Terra directly. The Custodians found themselves fighting an entirely new war, one that took place in the hidden tunnels beneath the palace, against enemies that defied conventional understanding. The war in the Webway was unlike any conflict the Custodians had fought before. The enemy was not flesh and blood warriors who could be cut down with blade and bolt. Instead, they faced demons, creatures of pure warp energy, given form through the malevolent will of the Chaos Gods. These beings did not fight with conventional tactics or strategies. They existed to bring corruption and death, to tear apart reality itself and drag humanity into the howling madness of the warp. Against such foes, even the might of the Custodians was tested to its limits. Constantin Valdor, Captain General of the Legio Custodes, led the defense of the Webway personally. Valdor was perhaps the greatest warrior the Custodians had ever produced, and a figure of such skill and power that even Primarchs spoke of him with respect. During the Battle of Prospero, when the Emperor had sent forces to censure Magnus for his use of forbidden sorcery, Valdor had proven himself against the psychically empowered warriors of the Thousand Suns. Now, in the depths beneath Terra, he would face threats that made that earlier conflict seem almost tame by comparison. The fighting in the Webway was brutal and unrelenting. The Custodians held choke points against waves of demons that should have overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. They fought in tunnels lit only by the glow of their weapons and the unnatural luminescence of warp energy. They stood their ground when the very fabric of reality seemed to tear around them, when the laws of physics bent and broke under the influence of chaos. And through it all, they maintained their discipline and their purpose. They were the Emperor's guardians, and they would hold this breach or die in the attempt. The toll was terrible. Custodians who had fought for centuries fell to the talons of bloodthirsters and the sorcery of pink horrors. Warriors who had never known defeat found themselves locked in desperate struggles against foes that could not truly be killed, only banished back to the warp. The precious auramite of their armor became splattered with the unreality of demon ichor. Their guardian spears, weapons that had served faithfully for centuries, began to show signs of corruption from constant exposure to warp energies. Yet still they fought, because to falter was to doom Terra and the Emperor himself. This brutal conflict continued for years, with the Custodians and their allies, including elements of the Sisters of Silence and detachments from loyalist Space Marine legions, holding the line in the Webway while the wider heresy raged across the galaxy. The Emperor himself was eventually forced to take the field, his psychic might the only thing capable of truly sealing the breach. But even his presence could not make the conflict any less brutal or the losses any less painful. Every custodian who fell was an irreplaceable loss, a warrior whose creation had required years of effort and the emperor's personal attention. As the heresy reached its climax, Horus gathered his forces for a final assault on Terra itself. The traitor armada that descended upon the Sol system was vast beyond comprehension. 9 traitor Space Marine legions, mere their ranks swollen with chaos-corrupted auxiliaries and demonic allies, arrived at Terra with the explicit goal of storming the Imperial Palace and killing the Emperor. The defenders of Terra knew that this would be the final battle, the moment when the fate of the Imperium would be decided. Either the Emperor and his loyalists would stand firm, or chaos would triumph, and humanity would be dragged into eternal damnation. The defense of Terra was coordinated by Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, who had spent years fortifying the Imperial Palace to withstand any assault. His defensive network was a masterpiece of military engineering, with multiple layers of walls, guns, and strongpoints designed to bleed the attackers at every step. But even Dawn knew that against the forces Horus had gathered, as conventional defenses would only slow the enemy, not stop them. The fate of Terra would ultimately be decided by the courage and skill of those willing to stand and fight. The Custodians were deployed at the most critical points of the defense, while Space Marine legions held the outer walls and fought pitched battles across Terra's surface. The Custodians maintained positions at key locations within the inner palace. They knew that if the traitors broke through the outer defenses, they would face a fighting withdrawal through prepared positions, each one defended by warriors who would sell their lives dearly. The Golden Host prepared for the coming storm, with the calm certainty of warriors who had trained their entire lives for this exact moment. When the assault began, it exceeded even the worst predictions. While the traitor forces crashed against Terra's defenses like a tide of steel and fury, orbital bombardments rained down on the planet's surface, turning entire districts into hellscapes of molten stone and burning promethium. Traitor titans stalked through the ruins, their weapons leveling fortifications that had been built to withstand millennia. Chaos Space Marines swarmed over the walls, their augmented strength and the corrupting touch of the warp making them even more dangerous than they had been as loyalists. The Custodians met them with golden fury. At the walls of the inner palace, where the Emperor's gardens had once bloomed with flowers from across the galaxy, Custodians stood shoulder to shoulder and held back charges that should have overwhelmed them. Their guardian spears wove patterns of death, by each strike claiming a traitor's life. Their bolt casters spoke with rhythmic precision, shells finding their marks even through the chaos of battle. When the Death Guard, their flesh bloated with disease and corruption, assaulted a key position, Constantine Valdor himself led the counterattack, his Apollonian spear, a weapon forged by the Emperor's own hand, cutting through plague marines like they were nothing more than vermin. The Battle of the Eternity Gate stands out as perhaps the most crucial engagement of the entire siege. The Eternity Gate was the final barrier between the traitor forces and the Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor himself maintained his psychic vigil against the powers of chaos. If the gate fell, the traitors would pour into the very heart of the Imperial Palace, and all would be lost. The defense of this position was entrusted primarily to the Custodians and the Blood Angels, with Sanguinius, the angel himself, taking personal command. The forces that assaulted the Eternity Gate represented the finest warriors Horus had at his command. Chaos Space Marines from the most vicious legions, demonic horrors given form, and traitor war machines all focused their fury on this single point. The fighting was apocalyptic in its intensity. The bodies piled so high that they formed ramps that subsequent waves of attackers used to reach the walls. The air became thick with blood and the stench of corruption. Reality itself seemed to bend under the weight of so much violence and hatred. Through it all, the Custodians held. They stood on the walls and the parapets, as their golden armor splattered with blood and gore, but still gleaming beneath the grime of battle. They cut down enemy after enemy, their training and skill making each of them worth dozens of traitor warriors. When a bloodthirster, a greater demon of Khorne, manifested on the walls and began slaughtering defenders. It was a squad of custodians who engaged it, their guardian spears finding gaps in its demonic hide, their combined might eventually banishing the creature back to the warp even as several of their number fell to its axe. The climax came when Angron, the demon primarch of the World Eaters, personally led an assault on the gate. Angron was no longer the tortured warrior who had once fought for the Emperor. He had ascended to demonhood, becoming a being of pure rage and hatred. His very presence radiated madness, driving those around him into berserk fury. Lesser warriors would have fled before such a foe. The Custodians charged forward to meet him. The battle between Sanguinius and Angron has become legendary, but less well known is that it was Custodians who held back the rest of Angron's forces while the two Primarchs dueled. World Eaters by the hundreds threw themselves at the Golden Line, and the Custodians cut them down. They fought not as individuals, despite their training emphasizing personal combat, but as a unified force, each warrior supporting his brothers, creating a wall of auramite and steel that the traitors could not break. When Sanguinius finally defeated Angron, driving the demon Primarch back into the warp, it was the Custodians who had held long enough to make that victory possible. But the Siege of Terra was not merely a story of glorious victories, it was a story of terrible sacrifice. The Custodians paid a heavy price for their defense of the Emperor. Warriors who had served since the Unification Wars fell to enemy blades. Veterans who had fought in the Great Crusade and stood at the Emperor's side for decades were cut down by overwhelming numbers. Ancient heroes whose names had been spoken with reverence for generations died holding positions that could not be abandoned. Each loss was felt keenly, not just because of the Custodians' individual worth, but because every fallen warrior represented a piece of the Emperor's own work destroyed. The final act of the siege came when the Emperor, recognizing that the battle could not be won through conventional means, teleported aboard Horus's flagship, or the Vengeful Spirit, accompanied by a force that included Constantine Valdor and other Custodians. What happened aboard that ship, in the final confrontation between the Emperor and his fallen son, is known only to those who were there. But when the Custodians returned to Terra carrying the Emperor's broken body, their grief was a physical thing that seemed to weigh down even their mighty forms. The Emperor had defeated Horus, but at a terrible cost. His mortal form was shattered, his consciousness barely clinging to the remnants of his flesh. The Custodians bore him to the Golden Throne, a device that would sustain his life and allow his psychic might to continue protecting humanity. But the Emperor could no longer walk among his people, could no longer guide his Custodians with his direct presence. While for warriors who had been created specifically to stand in the Emperor's company, this was a wound that could never truly heal. In their grief, the Custodians donned black cloaks, mourning garb that symbolized their failure to protect their master. They had held Terra against impossible odds, had fought battles that would become legend, had proven their worth beyond any doubt. But none of that mattered when measured against the fact that the Emperor had been struck down. For 10,000 years, the Custodians would wear those black cloaks as a reminder of their perceived failure, a burden they carried with grim determination. The Horus Heresy and the Siege of Terra proved definitively just how strong the Custodians truly were. They had stood against forces that would have shattered armies. He had held positions that should have been impossible to defend, had faced down daemon primarchs and legendary traitors. In the crucible of that terrible conflict, the strength of the Adeptus Custodes was tested to its absolute limits, and while they paid a terrible price, they did not break. They held, and in holding, they ensured that humanity would have a future, that the Imperium would survive to fight on. The eternal vigil. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, as the traitors were finally driven from Terra and the wounds of the siege began the long process of healing, the Adeptus Custodes withdrew from the wider galaxy. This withdrawal was not born of cowardice or weariness, though they had every right to both after the terrible battles they had fought. Instead, it sprang from a renewed dedication to their primary purpose. They were the Emperor's guardians, and with their master confined to the Golden Throne, unable to move or speak, that duty became more important than ever. The Custodians would maintain their vigil over the Emperor, watching and waiting, ensuring that no threat ever reached him again. This period, which would stretch for 10,000 years and continues to this day, represented a fundamental shift in how the Custodians operated. During the Great Crusade and the Heresy, they had occasionally ventured forth from Terra, accompanying the Emperor when he traveled or serving as his emissaries to distant worlds. Now, such excursions became exceedingly rare. The Custodians focused their attention entirely on the defense of Terra and the protection of the Imperial Palace. They became shadows, golden ghosts who moved through the halls of the palace but were rarely seen by outsiders. To most citizens of the Imperium, the Custodians became little more than legends, mythical warriors whose very existence was doubted by those who had never witnessed them firsthand. But this isolation did not mean the Custodians became complacent or weak. Far from it. They developed and refined training practices that pushed their already extraordinary capabilities to even greater heights. Chief among these practices were the blood games, brutal exercises that tested every aspect of a Custodian's abilities. In these games, individual Custodians would attempt to penetrate the palace's defenses and reach the Emperor, playing the role of assassins, trying to succeed where the Emperor's enemies had failed. And the rest of the Custodian Guard would defend against these attempts, creating a constant state of testing that ensured their vigilance never wavered. The blood games were not mere exercises. They were conducted with absolute seriousness. And while the Custodians playing the role of assassins would not actually attempt to harm the Emperor, they would use any means necessary to reach his throne. This meant that the defenders had to remain constantly alert, had to think like enemies, had to anticipate threats from directions they might never have considered. A Custodian attempting a blood game might spend years infiltrating the palace staff, disguising themselves as servitors or maintenance workers. They might sabotage security systems, bribe officials, or create diversions that would draw defenders away from critical positions. The defending Custodians had to detect and stop these attempts, a task that required constant vigilance and sharp wits. The tradition of blood games kept the Custodians sharp during the long millennia when their primary role was simply to stand guard. While other Imperial forces fought wars across the galaxy, the Custodians maintained their watch over the Emperor, participating in conflicts that outsiders never knew occurred. Assassination attempts against the Emperor were not uncommon. Chaos cultists, Xenos infiltrators, traitors within the Imperial government, all of them saw the Emperor as the keystone of Imperial power, and all of them sought to strike him down. Every single one of these attempts was stopped by the Custodians, often before the would-be assassins even reached Terra, as sometimes without the Imperium at large ever knowing there had been a threat. This defensive mindset did not mean the Custodians never left Terra. When threats emerged that directly endangered the throne world, they would sortie forth to eliminate those dangers. When corruption was discovered within the highest levels of Imperial government, Custodians would investigate and, if necessary, execute those who had betrayed their oaths. Their authority in matters touching on the Emperor's safety was absolute. Even inquisitors, those fearsome agents who answered to no one save the Emperor himself, would bow before a Custodian's judgment when that warrior was acting in his capacity as guardian of the Golden Throne. One of the most notable instances of Custodian intervention came during the Age of Apostasy, at one of the darkest periods in Imperial history. Gog Vandire, the High Lord of the Administratum and later the Ecclesiarch, had become a tyrant whose rule brought suffering to countless billions. His corruption and madness threatened to tear the Imperium apart from within. When his excesses became too great to ignore, it was the Custodians who took action. They contacted the brides of the Emperor, Vandire's personal bodyguard, whom he had convinced to serve him through lies and manipulation. Using secret passages that only they knew, passages that had been built into the Imperial Palace during the Emperor's time, the Custodians brought the leader of the brides before the Emperor himself. What that woman, Alicia Dominica, witnessed in the Emperor's presence is known only to her and the Custodians who escorted her. But when she emerged, she and her sisters immediately turned against Vandir, executing the tyrant and ending his reign of terror. From that moment forward, the brides of the Emperor would be known as the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, and they would serve as the Imperium's most devoted warriors. This intervention by the Custodians, brief though it was, changed the course of Imperial history and demonstrated that even in their isolation, they remained vigilant for threats to the Emperor's vision. Throughout these long millennia, the Custodians maintained their numbers at close to 10,000 warriors. The process of creating new Custodians continued, though without the Emperor's direct oversight, it became even more difficult and dangerous. The bioalchemists and chirurgeons who had learned the techniques from the Emperor continued their work. Though each new generation struggled to match the perfection of their predecessors, the loss of any Custodian was felt keenly, as replacing them was a process that took decades and often resulted in failure. But through careful management and occasional recruitment, the 10,000 endured. The Custodians also maintained their own internal hierarchies and organizations. While they all served the same ultimate purpose, there were degrees of specialization and seniority among them. The Companions, also called the Heteron Guard, were the most elite of the Custodians, warriors who had proven themselves beyond any doubt and who enjoyed the privilege of standing watch directly over the Emperor's throne room. To be selected as a companion was considered the highest honor a Custodian could achieve, a recognition that they had achieved a level of skill and dedication that set them apart even from their already exceptional brothers. Other specialized formations existed as well. The Alaris Custodians, clad in their Terminator armor, served as elite shock troops and teleported directly into the most dangerous situations. The Aquilon Terminators were even more heavily armed and armored, wielding weapons of such power that they could bring down enemy war machines with ease. The Venatari were jetpack-equipped warriors who could strike from the skies with devastating speed. Each of these specialized units underwent additional training beyond the already extensive education all Custodians received, becoming masters of their chosen disciplines. Hence, the Custodians also maintained another tradition that set them apart from other Imperial forces: the awarding of names. When a Custodian performed a deed of particular note, they would be granted a name that commemorated that achievement. This name would be added to their title, building up over time as they accumulated more honors. Constantin Valdor, for example, had earned 1,932 names by the time of the Horus Heresy, each one marking a different achievement or victory. These names were inscribed on the inside of a Custodian's armor, or, in some cases, directly into their bones through ritual scarification. They served as a personal history, a record of service that the warrior carried with them always. This practice of name-giving reinforced the individuality of each Custodian. While Space Marines found their identity in their chapter, in the brotherhood they shared with their battle brothers, Custodians defined themselves through their personal achievements. They did not seek glory for its own sake, but they took quiet pride in the names they earned, seeing them as proof that they were worthy of the Emperor's creation. To be a Custodian without names was to be young and unproven. To bear many names was to be recognized as a warrior of exceptional merit. As the millennia passed, the Custodians became a fixture of terror, a golden constant in a galaxy that was constantly changing. Empires rose and fell among the stars. New threats emerged from the darkness between galaxies. The Imperium adapted and evolved, but always at its heart, guarding the Emperor himself, stood the 10,000. They did not age, they did not weaken, did not falter in their purpose. Every day, every hour, every moment, they maintained their vigil. Enemy agents who tried to penetrate Terra's defenses were caught and eliminated. Corruption within the palace was rooted out and destroyed. Threats to the Emperor were identified and neutralized, often before they could fully manifest. To the rest of the Imperium, the Custodians became more myth than reality. Stories were told of golden giants who stood watch over the emperor, but few people ever actually saw them. Those who did see them, usually high-ranking officials who had business in the deepest parts of the palace, spoke of the encounter with awe and reverence. To stand in the presence of a custodian was to feel the weight of the emperor's power, to be reminded of what humanity could achieve, and to understand that there were forces in the galaxy that transcended normal understanding. This long vigil, stretching across 10,000 years, demonstrated a different kind of strength than the custodians had shown during the heresy. It was not the strength of combat or the ability to hold against impossible odds. It was the strength of patience, of dedication, of maintaining purpose across eons when that purpose might seem futile to lesser beings. The Emperor did not speak to them, did not acknowledge their service, did not provide guidance or encouragement. Yet still they stood, because that was what they had been created to do. That unwavering dedication, that ability to maintain perfect vigilance across millennia, was perhaps the ultimate demonstration of the custodian's strength. Now a new age dawns. As the 41st millennium drew to a close, events began to unfold that would shatter the 10,000-year vigil of the Adeptus Custodes. The galaxy had always been a dangerous place, but the threats facing the Imperium had reached a crescendo that could no longer be ignored. Abaddon, the Despoiler, the heir to Horus's mantle of Warmaster, launched his 13th Black Crusade from the Eye of Terror, and this time his objective was clear. He would break the Imperium and tear down everything the Emperor had built. The cataclysm he unleashed would change the galaxy forever and force the Custodians to reconsider their role in protecting humanity. The fall of Cardia, that fortress world which had stood guard over the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, sent shockwaves through the entire Imperium. When that world shattered, literally broken apart by the impact of the ancient Blackstone fortress, it created a wound in reality itself. The Great Rift tore across the galaxy, a vast warp storm that split the Imperium in two and plunged countless worlds into darkness. On Terra, the Psykers who maintained the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that guided ships through the warp, began dying at an alarming rate. The light they maintained, crucial to navigation throughout the Imperium, began to flicker and dim. In the halls of the Imperial Palace, the Custodians watched these developments with growing concern. Their Captain General, Trajan Valoris, was a warrior who had already proven himself exceptional, even among his exceptional brothers. Originally an Alaris Custodian, Valoris had performed feats that had become legendary within the Custodian Guard. And he had successfully completed 2 blood games, a record that remained unbroken, demonstrating an ability to penetrate the palace's defenses that no other custodian had matched. He had destroyed the Space Hulk Mournful Siren, led the defeat of a dangerous Genestealer cult, and spearheaded preemptive strikes against threats before they could fully manifest. Valoris recognized what many others could not or would not see. The age of isolation was ending. The Imperium faced threats on a scale not seen since the heresy, and the Custodians could not simply stand guard over Terra while the galaxy burned. Their duty was to protect the Emperor, yes, but protecting the Emperor meant protecting the Imperium he had created. If that Imperium fell, if humanity was destroyed, then their vigil would be meaningless. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Captain General began quietly preparing the Custodians for war beyond Terra's boundaries. This preparation was done with characteristic Custodian thoroughness. Valoris increased the frequency of blood games, ensuring that every Custodian maintained peak combat readiness. He ordered the recall of Sisters of Silence, those mysterious women whose psychic null abilities made them invaluable against warp-spawned threats. He reviewed and updated defensive protocols for Terra, coordinating with the Imperial Fists and other Space Marine chapters that helped garrison the throne world. And he waited, watching for the sign that would signal the moment to act. That sign came when Chaos forces, emboldened by the opening of the Great Rift, launched an assault on Terra itself. The Second Siege of Terra, as it came to be known, was nothing like the apocalyptic conflict of the Horus Heresy. This was a raid, a lightning strike by ornate forces that sought to strike at the heart of the Imperium, while it reeled from the shock of the Great Rift's opening. But even a raid by Chaos forces represented a dire threat. Demons materialized within the palace complex itself, their presence a violation of sacred ground that had not been penetrated since the heresy. If they reached the Golden Throne, all would be lost. Valoris led the response personally. For the first time in millennia, the Custodians marched out in force, 4,000 warriors forming up in the great courtyards of the palace. Their golden armor blazed in the dim light of Terra's shrouded sun. Their guardian spears held ready, their formation absolutely perfect. When the command was given, they advanced, and the demons of chaos learned why the Custodians were considered the Emperor's finest. The battle was brutal, but decisive. The Custodians cut through demonic hordes like a golden scythe through corrupted wheat. Their training, their equipment, their sheer superiority over their enemies manifested in a slaughter that left the courtyards of the palace slick with disappearing demon ichor. When greater demons appeared, thinking to break the golden line through sheer power, they found themselves surrounded and brought down by concentrated fire and coordinated melee attacks. The Custodians fought not as individuals, but as a unified force, demonstrating that despite their tradition of personal combat, they could function as an army when necessity demanded. Yet the climax of the battle came at the Lion's Gate, one of the primary entrances to the inner palace. Here, the demon forces made their last stand, trying desperately to force their way through before the Custodians could seal the breach. Valoris himself led the charge that broke this final push, his personal power and skill inspiring his brothers to heights of martial prowess that left even veteran warriors awed. When the battle ended and the last demon had been banished back to the warp, more than half of the 4,000 Custodians who had marched out were dead or grievously wounded. It was a staggering loss for a force that could not easily replace its fallen. But Terra had held, and the Emperor remained secure. Even as the Custodians dealt with the aftermath of this assault, another development was unfolding. Robut Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, had been resurrected on the world of Macragge. His return sent shockwaves through the Imperium. For 10,000 years, the Primarchs had been gone, dead or lost, or ascended to demonhood. The Loyalist Primarchs were legends, mythical figures from a golden age that could never return. And yet, here was Guilliman, the avenging son, back from the dead and leading his sons in battle once more. When Guilliman arrived at Terra, Valoris was there to meet him. The encounter between the Captain General of the Custodians and the returned Primarch was laden with significance. These two represented different eras of imperial history, different approaches to how the Emperor's vision should be realized. But they also shared a common purpose. Both sought to preserve and protect humanity. Or whatever differences might exist between them, whatever disagreements they might have about methods or priorities, they were ultimately on the same side. Guilliman's return and the cooperation between the Primarch and the Custodians marked a new era for the 10,000. Valoris formally renounced the black cloaks that Custodians had worn in mourning for 10 millennia, signaling that the age of withdrawal was over. The Custodians would once again venture forth into the galaxy, not as conquerors or crusaders, but as guardians of humanity acting beyond Terra's boundaries. They would hunt down threats before they could reach the throne world, eliminate corruption wherever they found it, and ensure that the Emperor's realm endured. This new role saw Custodians deployed across the galaxy in small forces, and as shield hosts and shield companies operating independently to deal with specific threats. They worked alongside other Imperial forces, coordinating with Space Marine chapters, Inquisitors, and military commanders to prosecute campaigns against humanity's enemies. Their presence in these campaigns often proved decisive. A single squad of Custodians could turn the tide of a battle. A shield company could break the back of an enemy invasion. Where they appeared, victory often followed. During the Indomitus Crusade, Guilliman's great effort to stabilize and reclaim the Imperium in the wake of the Great Rift, Custodians fought in numerous critical battles. At Gathalamor, Valoris personally led a combined force of Custodians and Grey Knights against Wordbearers, Chaos Space Marines who had summoned demonic hordes. At the Golden Warriors and Silver Knights broke the traitor force, banishing the demons and scattering the Chaos Marines in a display of coordinated military might that reminded the galaxy what the Emperor's forces could achieve when they worked together. In the Fourth Tyrannic War, when Hive Fleet Leviathan descended upon the galaxy in numbers that dwarfed previous Tyrannid invasions, Custodians fought in void battles aboard their ship, Manifest Judgment. They boarded Tyrannid bioships, carving through endless swarms of alien horrors to reach and destroy the synapse creatures that coordinated the hive mind's forces. These operations were desperately dangerous, with Custodians fighting in environments where a single misstep could mean death by vacuum or consumption by alien predators. But the risks were necessary, and the Custodians met them with their characteristic determination. The modern era has seen the Custodians prove repeatedly that their strength has not diminished despite 10,000 years of relative isolation. If anything, they have emerged from their vigil stronger and more focused than ever. The long centuries of maintaining watch, of perfecting their skills through blood games and constant training, have honed them to an even finer edge. When they finally marched to war once more, they brought with them not just the physical prowess they had always possessed, but also the wisdom and patience that came from millennia of service. Trajan Valoris himself exemplifies this new era of Custodian activity. He is not merely a warrior, though his combat prowess approaches that of the Primarchs of old. He is also a strategist and a leader, capable of coordinating complex operations across multiple theaters. He serves as one of the High Lords of Terror, bringing a Custodian voice to the highest levels of imperial governance for the first time since the heresy. His presence in that council ensures that the Custodians' perspective, their understanding of threats to the Imperium, their dedication to the Emperor's vision, is represented in the decisions that shape imperial policy. The return of the Custodians to active war beyond Terra has not been without controversy. Some within the Imperium question whether these warriors should leave the Emperor's side, whether their primary duty demands that they remain on Terra regardless of external threats. But Valoris and his brothers understand something that these critics do not. The Imperium is the Emperor's work, and his gift to humanity. To protect the Emperor means protecting that work, ensuring that humanity endures and thrives. Standing guard over a corpse, no matter how sacred, while the Emperor's vision crumbles around them, would be the ultimate betrayal of their duty. As the 42nd millennium dawns, the Adeptus Custodes stand ready to face whatever threats may come. They are no longer isolated guardians, cloistered away in the imperial palace. They are active defenders of humanity, golden warriors who carry the Emperor's light to the darkest corners of the galaxy. But they have not abandoned their primary purpose. For every Custodian deployed beyond Terra, dozens more maintain their vigil over the Golden Throne, ensuring that the Emperor remains secure no matter what storms may rage across the Imperium. The strength of the Custodians in this new age is not merely their physical might or their martial skill. It is their ability to adapt while remaining true to their core purpose. They have recognized that the galaxy has changed, that new threats require new responses, but they have not lost sight of what they are and why they were created. They are the Emperor's guardians, and whether that means standing watch over his throne or carrying his vengeance to distant stars, they will fulfill that role with the same dedication that has defined them for 10,000 years. The art of Golden War, understanding the true strength of the Adeptus Custodes, requires examining not just their physical capabilities or their equipment, but the way they approach combat itself. The Custodians do not fight like Space Marines or Imperial Guardsmen or any other force in the Imperium. Their combat doctrine is uniquely their own, shaped by their role as guardians rather than soldiers, by their individual enhancement rather than mass production, and by the absolute standards of perfection that define everything they do. When a custodian enters battle, they bring with them a martial philosophy refined over 10,000 years of defending the emperor against every conceivable threat. The first and most obvious characteristic of custodian combat doctrine is their emphasis on individual excellence. Unlike Space Marines, who are trained to fight as part of a cohesive unit, custodians are primarily warriors who operate independently. Each custodian is fully capable of functioning alone, making their own tactical decisions, assessing threats independently, and engaging enemies without requiring orders or coordination from others. This is not arrogance or lack of discipline. It is a fundamental aspect of how they were designed. The Emperor created them to be individuals who could think and act independently, understanding that his guardians needed to be capable of dealing with any situation without requiring constant direction. This individual focus means that custodians do not develop the same deep bonds of brotherhood that characterize Space Marine chapters. They do not have squad leaders in the traditional sense, do not practice elaborate coordinated maneuvers, do not think in terms of mutual support and covering fire. Instead, each custodian is essentially an army unto themselves, a complete warrior who needs no one else to be fully effective. When custodians do work together, it is more like multiple soloists performing in perfect harmony than like a coordinated unit executing a practiced drill. But this should not be taken to mean that custodians cannot or do not coordinate with each other. When the situation demands it, they are perfectly capable of operating as a unified force. The difference is that this coordination comes from individual custodians recognizing what needs to be done and acting accordingly, rather than from following a rigid command structure or pre-planned formations. If a custodian sees that a particular enemy needs to be eliminated, they will move to engage that target, trusting that their brothers will handle other threats. This fluid, adaptive approach allows custodians to respond to changing battlefield conditions with a speed and flexibility that more rigidly structured forces cannot match. The second key aspect of custodian combat doctrine is their emphasis on overwhelming violence applied with surgical precision. When a custodian engages an enemy, they do not seek to merely defeat that foe. They seek to utterly annihilate them. This is not brutality for its own sake, but rather a recognition that anything less than total destruction leaves room for the enemy to recover or retaliate. A wounded enemy can still be dangerous, can still threaten the Emperor. A dead enemy cannot. Therefore, custodians strike with maximum force, ensuring that each blow is lethal and that no enemy gets a second chance to pose a threat. This philosophy manifests in combat as a style that is simultaneously elegant and terrifyingly effective. A custodian's guardian spear becomes a blur of motion, each strike precisely calculated to inflict maximum damage. They don't just parry enemy attacks, they redirect those attacks into positions that leave enemies vulnerable to counterstrikes. They don't just dodge enemy fire, they move in ways that position them for optimal engagement angles. Every motion serves multiple purposes, defensive and offensive at once, creating a seamless flow of combat that appears almost like a deadly dance. The speed at which custodians operate is one of their most significant advantages. Even Space Marines, with their enhanced reflexes and centuries of combat experience, struggle to track a custodian in full combat. While the combination of genetically enhanced reflexes, perfect training, and equipment that responds to the wearer's intentions almost instantaneously allows custodians to react to threats faster than most enemies can even perceive those threats. By the time an enemy realizes they are under attack, they are already dead, bisected by a guardian spear, or obliterated by a precisely placed bolt shell. The third defining characteristic of custodian combat doctrine is their emphasis on eliminating threats before they fully manifest. The custodians do not wait for enemies to attack. They identify potential threats and neutralize them preemptively. This proactive approach stems from their fundamental role as guardians. A reactive guardian is ultimately a failure, forced to respond to threats that should never have been allowed to develop. A successful guardian identifies and eliminates dangers before they can strike at their charge. This philosophy extends beyond the battlefield. Custodians are trained in investigation, infiltration, and intelligence gathering to a degree that rivals the Inquisition. When they identify a potential threat to Terra or the Emperor, they will pursue that threat relentlessly, tracking it to its source and destroying it root and branch. This might mean infiltrating a noble house suspected of harboring traitors, spending years gathering evidence before moving to eliminate the entire organization. It might mean tracking a chaos cult across multiple star systems, observing their activities until the perfect moment to strike. Custodians have the patience to wait for the right opportunity and the ruthlessness to exploit it when it presents itself. At the fourth key aspect of custodian combat effectiveness is their ability to operate in any environment against any foe. Unlike specialized units that excel in particular situations, but struggle in others, custodians are generalists of the highest order. They are equally effective in void combat, urban warfare, wilderness operations, or defensive sieges. They can engage enemy infantry, destroy armored vehicles, eliminate flying targets, or counter psychic threats. Their training and enhancement makes them capable of adapting to virtually any tactical situation. This versatility is supported by the comprehensive education custodians receive. They study the tactics and capabilities of every major threat the Imperium faces. They understand how chaos forces operate, what tactics various xenospecies employ, and how corrupted Imperial forces might attack. This knowledge allows them to anticipate enemy actions and formulate effective counters almost instantaneously. When a custodian faces a new enemy, they don't need to spend time figuring out how to fight it. Their extensive education and analytical capabilities allow them to assess the threat and determine the optimal response in moments. The psychological impact of custodians in combat cannot be understated either. The sight of golden giants advancing across a battlefield, their armor gleaming even through smoke and fire, their weapons crackling with power, is enough to break the morale of most enemies before the first shot is fired. Cultists and traitors who might stand firm against space marines flee in terror when custodians appear. Even disciplined enemy soldiers find their resolve wavering when they realize they face warriors who seem more like divine beings than mortal men. This psychological warfare is entirely intentional. The Emperor designed the custodians to be impressive, to inspire awe and terror in equal measure. Their golden armor is not merely protective, it is a symbol, a visual representation of the Emperor's power made manifest. When enemies see custodians, they see their own doom approaching in resplendent gold, and that knowledge saps their will to resist. Many battles involving custodians end with enemy forces routing or surrendering rather than facing these warriors in actual combat. The custodians' combat doctrine also includes an interesting paradox. They are both incredibly aggressive and supremely patient when action is required, but they strike with overwhelming force and accept no half measures. But they are equally capable of waiting for extended periods, maintaining perfect vigilance, enduring conditions that would break lesser warriors. This combination of explosive violence and endless patience makes them ideal for both offensive operations and defensive postures, able to switch between the two as circumstances require. Their fighting style also incorporates what are known as martial katas, specialized combat stances and techniques that have been developed and refined over millennia. Each kata represents a different approach to combat, optimized for dealing with specific types of threats or situations. A custodian might employ the Dakaterai stance when facing numerically superior enemies, techniques designed to maximize killing efficiency against large groups. Against heavily armored foes, they might switch to the Rendak stance, focusing on strikes that penetrate defenses and exploit weaknesses in enemy armor. These katas are not rigid forms, but rather frameworks that inform how a custodian approaches combat, providing proven strategies while still allowing for the individual creativity and adaptation that characterizes their fighting style. The effectiveness of custodian combat doctrine is proven by their historical record. Throughout their 10,000 years of service, the occasions when custodians have actually been defeated are remarkably rare. Yes, individual custodians have fallen in battle. No warrior is truly invincible, and even the mightiest can be overwhelmed by sufficient force or unfortunate circumstances. But strategic defeats are situations where custodian forces fail to accomplish their objectives are almost unheard of. When the Emperor sends custodians to deal with a threat, that threat is eliminated. When custodians establish a defensive position, that position does not fall. The certainty of custodian success is so well established that their very presence can change the strategic calculations of Imperial commanders. However, the custodians' combat doctrine does have weaknesses that stem from their strengths. Their emphasis on individual excellence means they lack the institutional knowledge and practices that allow Space Marines to rapidly replace casualties and maintain unit cohesion through heavy losses. A Space Marine chapter that loses a squad can reorganize and continue fighting with minimal disruption. If a shield company of custodians suffers significant casualties, the loss of those individual warriors, each one irreplaceable and unique, creates gaps that cannot be easily filled. This makes custodians somewhat vulnerable to wars of attrition, situations where their small numbers can be ground down over time. Their focus on the defense of Terra and the Emperor also means that custodians sometimes struggle with broader strategic thinking required for galactic-scale warfare. They are exceptionally skilled at tactical operations, at identifying and eliminating specific threats, but thinking in terms of campaigns spanning multiple sectors or coordinating vast military operations is not their primary expertise. And this is why custodians often work best when paired with Space Marines or other Imperial forces who can handle the broader strategic picture, while the custodians focus on critical tactical objectives. Despite these limitations, the combat doctrine of the Adeptus Custodes represents one of the most effective military philosophies in the Imperium. It produces warriors who can function independently, adapt to any situation, and bring overwhelming force to bear precisely where it is needed. When combined with their physical superiority, exceptional equipment, and millennia of accumulated experience, it makes custodians among the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy. To face a custodian in combat is to face perfection itself, golden and terrible, and very few who make that challenge survive the encounter. And beyond the battlefield, while much discussion of custodian strength focuses on their physical prowess and martial capabilities, their true power extends far beyond the battlefield. The custodians are not merely warriors, they are philosophers, diplomats, investigators, and guardians of human culture and achievement. Understanding the full scope of their strength requires examining these other dimensions of their existence, the ways in which they serve the Emperor and the Imperium that go beyond simple violence. The education that every custodian receives is comprehensive in ways that few outside their order can truly appreciate. From their earliest days, as their bodies are being transformed through bioalchemy, their minds are being shaped as well. They study the great works of human philosophy, from the ancient texts of Terra's various civilizations to the more recent writings of Imperial scholars. They learn to appreciate art in all its forms: music, sculpture, painting, literature. They study the history of humanity in exhaustive detail, understanding not just the major events, but the subtle currents and patterns that shape civilizations over time. This cultural education serves multiple purposes. On one level, it makes custodians into fit companions for the Emperor, warriors who could stand in his presence and hold intelligent conversations about any topic he might wish to discuss. The Emperor is not merely a military leader or a political figure. He is the greatest mind humanity has ever produced, interested in all aspects of human achievement. His guardians needed to be capable of matching that interest, of understanding what they were protecting when they fought to preserve humanity. On a more practical level, this broad education makes custodians exceptionally effective at their role as guardians. Understanding human culture allows them to better understand human motivations, to anticipate how individuals and groups might act in various circumstances. A custodian investigating a potential threat can draw on their knowledge of psychology, sociology, and history to predict how that threat might manifest and develop. They can identify patterns of behavior that indicate corruption or treachery. They can recognize when seemingly innocent actions are actually parts of more sinister plans. The diplomatic capabilities of custodians are similarly impressive. When a custodian speaks, they do so with the full authority of the emperor himself. But their words carry weight not just because of the physical threat they represent, but because they are known to be wise, intelligent, and absolutely trustworthy. A custodian delivering a message from the emperor can expect to be heard with utmost respect and seriousness. A custodian negotiating on behalf of the Imperium brings to the table not just military might, but also keen insight into political realities and human nature. Throughout imperial history, there have been occasions when custodians served as emissaries to important figures or factions. During the Great Crusade, the emperor would sometimes send individual custodians to deliver messages to primarchs or other key leaders, knowing that the presence of his guardian would ensure the message was received with appropriate gravity. In more recent times, custodians have represented the emperor's interests in dealings with the High Lords of Terror, with chapter masters of Space Marine chapters, and with other powerful figures within the Imperium. The investigative capabilities of the custodians are particularly noteworthy. While the Inquisition is famous for rooting out heresy and corruption, the custodians conduct their own investigations into matters that touch on the security of Terra or the Emperor. These investigations are conducted with thoroughness that borders on obsessive, with custodians leaving no stone unturned in their pursuit of the truth. They have access to resources and information that even the Inquisition cannot match, including ancient records from the Emperor's own time and secret passages throughout the Imperial Palace that allow them to observe without being observed. Or when a custodian concludes that a threat exists, their judgment is accepted without question by most imperial authorities. The custodians are known to be incorruptible, immune to bribes or threats, dedicated solely to the protection of the emperor. If a custodian declares that a particular individual or organization represents a danger to Terra, that entity will be investigated by others and, if the custodian's assessment is confirmed, destroyed. The word of a custodian carries a weight in imperial politics that few other voices can match. This combination of warrior prowess and intellectual capability makes custodians uniquely suited for certain types of operations that require both aspects. When a threat needs to be investigated and then eliminated, when intelligence must be gathered before decisive action can be taken. When political complications surround military necessities, custodians are often the ideal solution. They can conduct the investigation themselves, gathering information and assessing the situation with their own eyes, and then immediately transition to eliminating the threat once they have all the facts. This removes the delays and potential security breaches that come from involving multiple organizations or passing information between different agencies. The cultural impact of the custodians on Terra itself is also significant. While they are rarely seen by most of the planet's population, their presence is felt throughout Terran society. The nobility, from whose ranks custodian recruits are drawn, view the possibility that one of their children might be chosen as the highest honor imaginable. As families who have provided custodian recruits are revered among their peers, their status elevated by association with the Emperor's chosen guardians. This creates a complex social dynamic where the most powerful families on Terra compete to produce children who might be deemed worthy of transformation into custodians. This system ensures that the custodians maintain a connection to Terran nobility while also encouraging those noble families to maintain certain standards of genetic purity and physical excellence. A family that produces weak or genetically compromised offspring will not provide custodian candidates, damaging their prestige and political standing. And the result is a form of social engineering that helps maintain the quality of Terra's ruling class while also ensuring a steady supply of potential recruits for the custodian guard. The Custodians also serve as living symbols of what humanity can achieve. In an Imperium where the average citizen lives a life of drudgery and hardship, where mutation and corruption are constant threats, the Custodians represent perfection. They are proof that humanity, when properly directed and enhanced, can rival or exceed anything the galaxy has to offer. This symbolic role is not to be underestimated. The knowledge that the Emperor has created such warriors, that they stand eternal guard over him, provides hope and inspiration to countless billions who would otherwise have none. Within the Imperial Palace itself, but the Custodians serve additional roles beyond simple guard duty. They maintain the Hall of Names, a vast chamber where the names and deeds of fallen Custodians are recorded for posterity. They oversee the dark cells, maximum security prisons, where the most dangerous entities in the Imperium are kept. They maintain the silent vaults, repositories of forbidden knowledge and dangerous artifacts that must be kept from falling into the wrong hands. They guard the ancient gene laboratories where new Custodians are created, ensuring that these secrets remain absolutely secure. Perhaps most importantly, the Custodians serve as the final guardians of the Emperor's true purpose and vision. While the Imperium has evolved and changed over 10,000 years, often in ways that would be unrecognizable to those who fought in the Great Crusade, yet the Custodians remember. They know what the Emperor intended, what he was trying to achieve, what his ultimate goals for humanity were. This knowledge makes them uniquely positioned to judge whether new developments serve or harm the Emperor's vision. While they rarely interfere directly in imperial governance, when they do speak on such matters, their words carry enormous weight. The intellectual and cultural strength of the Custodians also manifests in their approach to their own existence. Unlike Space Marines, who often develop elaborate belief systems around their primarchs and their chapter's history, Custodians maintain a more philosophical approach to their service. They understand that they are warriors created for a specific purpose, enhanced beyond normal human limits to fulfill that purpose. They take pride in their abilities and their achievements, but they do not lose themselves in mythology or symbolism. This clarity of purpose, this understanding of their own nature, gives them a psychological resilience that complements their physical strength. When considering the question of how strong the Custodians are, these non-martial capabilities must be factored into any complete answer. Yes, a Custodian is physically superior to a Space Marine, better equipped, more skilled in combat, but they are also more intelligent, more cultured, more politically astute, more investigatively capable. They are warriors, certainly, perhaps the finest warriors humanity has ever produced. But they are also much more than that. They are the complete package, perfect human beings in nearly every measure, is shaped by the Emperor's own hand to be worthy of standing in his presence. That totality of excellence is perhaps the truest measure of their strength. Conclusion. Guardians Eternal. When we began this exploration into the strength of the Adeptus Custodes, we asked a seemingly simple question. How strong are these golden warriors? Now, having journeyed through their history, examined their creation, witnessed their battles, and understood their role in the Imperium, we can see that the question was never simple at all. The strength of the Custodians cannot be measured merely in terms of how many enemies they can defeat or how much damage they can withstand. Their strength is something more profound, more complete, more essential to understanding what the Imperium truly represents. The Custodians are strong in the most literal sense, yes. While they are physically superior to nearly any other warrior in the galaxy, a single Custodian can face odds that would overwhelm entire squads of Space Marines. Their reflexes operate at speeds that make them appear supernatural. Their durability allows them to survive wounds that would kill even transhuman warriors instantly. When they engage in combat, they bring to bear capabilities that represent the absolute peak of what human genetic engineering can achieve. In terms of raw martial prowess, there are few beings in the galaxy who can match a Custodian, and fewer still who could hope to defeat one in single combat. But their strength goes far beyond the physical. They are mentally superior as well, possessing intellects that rival the greatest minds in the Imperium. Their training encompasses not just the arts of war, but the entire breadth of human achievement. They are scholars who could debate philosophy with the finest thinkers in the galaxy. They are diplomats who can navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics with skill that would shame professional courtiers. They are investigators whose thoroughness and insight allow them to uncover threats that other organizations might miss entirely. When we speak of the strength of the Custodians, we must include this intellectual and cultural superiority as well. They are strong in purpose, maintaining a focus and dedication that has endured for 10,000 years without wavering. Lesser warriors might grow complacent during long periods of peace, might lose sight of their original purpose as generations passed. The Custodians have done neither, yet they have stood guard over the Emperor since the moment of their creation, and they will continue to stand guard until the stars themselves grow cold. This unwavering dedication, this absolute clarity of purpose, is a form of strength that perhaps exceeds even their physical capabilities. They are strong in their incorruptibility. Throughout their long history, no Custodian has ever turned traitor. Not during the Horus Heresy, when half the Space Marine legions fell to chaos. Not during the Age of Apostasy, when corruption reached the highest levels of imperial government. Not during any of the countless crises that have threatened to tear the Imperium apart over the millennia. The Custodians have remained absolutely loyal, absolutely pure, absolutely dedicated to their purpose. In a galaxy where corruption is a constant threat, where the powers of chaos constantly seek to subvert and twist humanity's defenders, this purity is perhaps the Custodians' greatest strength. They are strong in their perfection. Everything about a Custodian, from the genetic code that shapes their cells, to the armor they wear, to the weapons they wield, represents the absolute best that humanity can produce. They are not merely good at what they do, they are as close to perfect as mortal beings can become. This perfection is not accidental or incidental. It is the result of the Emperor's deliberate design, his gift to himself of guardians who would be worthy of standing in his presence. When we witness a Custodian in action, we are witnessing human potential realized to its fullest extent. But perhaps most importantly, the Custodians are strong in what they represent. They are living proof that humanity can achieve greatness, that the species has potential beyond what most can imagine. In an Imperium where the average citizen lives a life of grinding hardship, where mutation and corruption threaten on every side, where hope is often in short supply, the Custodians stand as monuments to human achievement. They prove that when properly directed, when given the resources and knowledge necessary, humanity can create warriors who rival anything the galaxy has to offer. The return of the Custodians to active war in the current era represents not just the deployment of an exceptionally powerful military force, but a statement about the Imperium's determination to survive. For 10,000 years, these warriors stood guard over terror, maintaining their vigil while the galaxy burned. And now they have emerged from that long watch, bringing with them all the skill and experience accumulated over millennia of service. Where they appear on the battlefield, victory follows. Where they investigate threats, those threats are eliminated. Where they stand guard, nothing passes. To be a Custodian is to exist in a state of perpetual readiness, knowing that at any moment you might be called upon to face the greatest threats the galaxy can produce. It is to carry the weight of the Emperor's personal attention, to be shaped by his hand into a weapon and guardian without equal. It is to live for thousands of years, witnessing the rise and fall of empires, accumulating experience and wisdom that few beings can match. It is to be both more and less than human, while transcending mortal limitations, while remaining fundamentally dedicated to humanity's survival and prosperity. The question, how strong are the Custodians, can now be answered, though perhaps not in the simple terms the question might seem to demand. They are strong enough to defend the Emperor against any threat. They are strong enough to serve as his emissaries to the most powerful figures in the Imperium. They are strong enough to maintain their purpose and purity across 10,000 years of service. They are strong enough to stand as symbols of human achievement, inspiring hope in a galaxy that offers precious little. They are, in every measure that matters, exactly as strong as they need to be to fulfill their purpose. As the Imperium faces an uncertain future, as new threats emerge and old enemies grow bolder, the Adeptus Custodes stand ready. They are the Emperor's gift to humanity, the golden guardians who have never faltered and never will. They are proof that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, there remain forces of such excellence and dedication that they can give humanity hope of survival. They are the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the Emperor's own chosen warriors, and they are exactly as strong as they need to be. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the strength of the Adeptus Custodes, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Share this video with fellow fans of Warhammer 40k who might be interested in learning more about these golden warriors. And let me know in the comments what other aspects of the 40k universe you'd like me to explore. Until next time, may the Emperor protect.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.